back in the bottle. So, that's where I hope we can move forward with just common sense discussion and understandings about the real threat that um, uh, persistent and pervasive use of weapons are.
True, true. Yeah, you broke up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. So, I mean, what you're saying is basically, you know, in your background, you used, weapons, in a theater of war. So you understand, the application, the necessity. I mean, I highly doubt you would have felt as secure, deployed with, a book of platitudes to throw at your enemies. So, there's a practical application. These weapons do exist, and they're not just going to vanish overnight. Even if they are taken from in Charlton Heston's words, anybody's cold dead hands. They're going to end up in somebody else's live warm hands, and somebody's going to have to relinquish those weapons at that point and seize those weapons. And that's not, if someone doesn't want to give them up, then you're literally bringing nothing to a gunfight. So I appreciate your perspective. Greg, what are your thoughts?
So I come at this from a right of center perspective. I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Navy. I tried to join the Marines, but I actually broke my leg during physical training and failed the physical fitness test. So I did just
Gotcha.
a lawyer instead. But I used to be the vice chairman for the Wake County Republican Party many years ago. I've been a Republican candidate. I've been a donor. I've been a volunteer, and I've been a gun owner for. I actually got my concealed carry permit while I was in law school. I've got a Smith and Wesson M&P9 here in the apartment. I've used guns for a while. I hate to say I grew up as part of a gun culture with Duck Hunt and everything else
Yeah.
back when video games were starting to expand for me. My dad had a pistol. I learned how to shoot a rifle. I'm not very good at it, frankly. I'm better at the handgun. But to me, it's just not I accept completely that they're dangerous and we don't want to have people who don't know to responsibly use them to have them. But it's not something that is uncomfortable to me. I mean, I'm used to being around weapons. I don't go to gun shows recreationally, but I've been at them and it's not terribly a big challenge that I see as far as our current political climate. I mean, is kind of mean. I mean, I think everyone can agree to that. Just in the past week, if you don't count Pennsylvania, fine, but you've still got Ohio, you've still got Texas, you still had California the week before that. It's a very recurring thing, and the political climate. Sorry, forgive me. I don't know if your listeners are aware. I've got both a dog and a cat
Yeah.
that think it's very weird that I'm talking to a laptop right now.
It's okay.
So the dog is like at my left side, pawing at me to pay him some attention.
Gotcha.
The challenge is that the politicians aren't really getting anything done. And in terms of the gun debate, a lot of the participants, there's an asymmetry in terms of what they're passionate about. So gun owners are super passionate about gun rights. They vote based on gun rights. Folks who are more concerned about gun restrictions are actually motivated by other issues most of the time. So they won't vote based on gun stuff. They'll vote based on healthcare or based on fiscal policy or anything like that. So you've got an asymmetry in terms of passion. You've got a nomenclature problem, frankly. I mean, you see this every time people talk about assault weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Every gun is an assault weapon, just
Yeah.
by definition. You use it to assault things or people.
Yeah.
But then trying to figure out how to define it, that sets off alarm bells for the folks that are, what you want to call colloquially a gun nut.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a vocabulary problem there as well. So I agree with Mark. I'd like to see some kind of consensus on at least some stuff. I certainly think there are a lot of possibilities that are still constitutional, but from a default pro-gun position as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I agree with you. I mean, I do hear, and that distinguishing aspect in regard to the dialogue stands out to me. It's quite prominent in regard to how that nomenclature affects just the discourse. My issue isn't so much with the nomenclature, but with gun proponents basically using that as a point of dismissal for a dialogue. Like basically, if you don't know what an assault rifle is, you shouldn't have the ability to talk about what rights are because you aren't informed on the issue, and so off with you, you bleeding heart soy boy pacifist or whatever. Um, and I think that's really affected how we talk about it and polarized the atmosphere where you have gun owners over here who speak the language, who speak the lingo, who are quote unquote qualified to make these decisions about whether or not a gun should or shouldn't be in the hands of the public. And I haven't heard anybody advocate uh, consistently. I haven't heard a consistent argument for the elimination of any firearms whatsoever. Like, I'll hear one person over here saying, yeah, these kinds of handguns should be outlawed, or these kind of modifications should exist. Where somebody else over here will say, no, those modifications are infringing upon my rights, and if I can't get access to my gun or utilize my gun, for instance, fingerprint identification, what happens if something goes wrong with the chip in the handgun, and I can't use my gun whenever I need to use it? What's the point of having a firearm at that point? And so you have a separation, I feel, that's occurred between gun owners and the non-gun owning population that's affecting how we can talk.
I think though that that you have to give them a fair shake here. That the kind of arguments are also that a lot of what is suggested, a lot of what is proposed as gun control is not really directly affecting any kind of meaningful metrics in reducing violence.
Sure.
They will say what could you propose that would have that would have prevented any of these mass shootings, or at least this last week. Or it's like, why would you why would you restrict the silencer? That it doesn't really silence a gun. It's just to help my hearing. Mm-hmm. Or that restricting semi-automatic rifles are there's no benefit to that when you could fire off the same number of rounds with a handgun. Mm-hmm. Rifles are really only used in something like 1% of all killings anyways. So where's the benefit that would warrant the restriction on my rights?
I agree. And so, I mean, you're then it comes back to, like you said, I mean, the nomenclature, like, if there is a gun that fires, it's a handgun that fires as much as a semi-automatic, rifle does. And feel free to correct me, gentlemen. Like I said, I'm not versed in the language, the lingo of gun ownership. So I may mess around and call something that's not supposed to. But like most Americans, my knowledge, it comes from either video games or movies. So, I mean, I do know, I study enough in regard to the technical aspect of the use. I mean, I know, like in the 80s, whenever you had, Super Rambo with endless, clips, that's not real. But whenever you're talking about more modern day films where, individuals have hired technicians who are hired to be on set to make sure things are accurate, case in point, John Wick, you're not going to have those kind of endless, gunfights. People run out of ammunition and they have to find some way to reload and stuff like that or whatever. So I feel like I'm more informed than I would have been if I was, talking about this in, 1980 when I was like, 5 or 6. But yeah, like, I think that's another big gap, is a lot of people aren't informed. Do you feel like, more education will help in regard to addressing this debate on top of, I mean, we know there is, a gridlock in regard to our government, but do you think that we'd be able to push back more effectively against that gridlock if people were more informed?
Well, the challenge you got to have is the folks. More education helps, but at the same time, the people that are like, guns are, I hate to use it's a pun in this case, but guns are triggering for them. Mm-hmm. The education is not something that they're going to necessarily want, because that, it's a harm reduction measure on their part to not, like, someone who's been a victim of gun violence is not going to give a whit one way or the other what a given gun is called. They know they've been a victim of gun violence. They want to know that similar situations are not going to happen in the future. So it would help, yes. Does that mean it's ever going to happen? That's a struggle. One of the key phrases you always hear talked about, and you mentioned it on your side, semi-automatic.
Mm-hmm.
People hear that and they think, oh my gosh, that just means I hold down the trigger and I'm just going to keep spraying bullets. And that's not what it is. A semi-automatic weapon just means it uses the recoil of the shot to chamber the next round. You still have to pull the trigger once a piece. So the vast majority of all legal firearms are semi-automatic.
Okay.
The only ones that are not are the revolvers, where you pull the trigger and the chamber goes around in a circle. But every handgun, most rifles, everything else are considered semi-automatic. The fully automatic stuff, like you see in Rambo, or Walking Dead, they never run out of ammunition in The Walking Dead.
Yeah, that's yeah.
That type of stuff is that type of stuff is federally regulated, and it's banned except for military use typically, and now we've got the police using it as well. But education would help, but it's a struggle trying to have folks who are victims, for example, or are passionate about the issue but not on the pro side, trying to get them up to the same level of nomenclature and understanding the nuances and such, to do that en masse for it to matter. So that's problem one, is that trying to educate people who also want the education is a challenge. Another piece is that our politicians generally are idiots, and not just about guns, but about everything. My undergrad degree was in computer science, and I am terrified every time Congress talks about regulating anything involving technology, because it doesn't matter what party they are, they're dumb as hell. If you look at some of the stuff with FOSTA is the acronym. I can't remember what the specific thing is for, but they're trying to take down certain websites like Backpage and things like that. What's called Section 230, which is a protection for platform providers if they get sued for online speech. So if the next mass shooter posts on Facebook, Congress people want to take the protection away so that you can sue Facebook. And so many of them don't understand how that technology works, and it's apparent in hearings that they conduct. I can't remember the name of the shooters in California, probably about 2 years or so ago, but where they had seized the iPhones, and the FBI was trying to get Apple to unlock them, and Apple refused.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then there was this extensive conversation in a completely different hearing where they had a Google executive there, and the congressperson was talking about his iPhone, and the Google executive is like, we're not Apple. We don't have any of this stuff. And the guy in Congress didn't even pick up on that because he's a politician. He's trying to get reelected. So you look at people who are accustomed to having guns, and they're seeing the difference in education level among the populace, but then they're also listening to the politicians who they're terrified that once they start regulating something, they're not going to know what it is that they're regulating, and they're just going to go buck wild with it. The question of whether or not something violates our rights, ultimately that's going to get resolved by courts regardless. We got to get to the preliminary question first of what policies can we get a majority of politicians to be on board with enacting. If they go overboard, you can rely on the courts after the fact to pare that back. But we're not even at the point of getting proposals enacted in the first place.
Well, speaking about that, those policies, Mark, what are your thoughts?
Well, my follow-up though is that do we really have any major anti-gun or at least pro-gun control organizations out there that can stand toe-to-toe with the NRA's efforts? All the NRA needs to educate legislators, and to be honest, the average citizen that's not one of its members on guns is to leave your filthy hands off of them. We don't have necessarily an education arm or organization, except for maybe, I don't know, the Brady organization. I forget what it's called. But, who is actually standing and lobbying against, these absolute, free reign and free sale of weapons, unless you all know some.
Well, I was going to say that the organizations are out there. You've got Moms Demand Gun Sense. You've got Bloomberg's Every Town for Gun Safety. They exist. They've not been around for as long as the gun rights lobby. So it's not just the NRA. You've got the National Association for Gun Rights. You've got a lot of state affiliates. So, for example, here in North Carolina, you've got Grassroots NC, which, the NRA generally, believe it or not, is looked down upon by a lot of gun owners. because they're seen as ineffective and focusing on the grift, for lack of a better word. And that's obvious now with like Wayne LaPierre trying to get himself a mansion and everything else. So there are groups on both sides. I would say the gun control side is finally starting to, raise up their profile on a level where the gun rights folks have been for decades now. So they exist. Whether or not they're effective is another matter.
I think they have to, be more effective at gathering support, from the public, and just like the NRA has, with its millions of members, pushing to get these things happening, because that's where the real power of the NRA lies. I mean, it's sure we have lots of money going to politicians to support their agendas, but it comes from their voting members that these people are politically activated, and they're voters. They'll vote on these issues. And so actually I'm wondering, when we have their dear supreme leader saying that they're going to be that he's talking about taking the guns first and due process later, it doesn't take anything to, I mean, that's a pretty bad sign if you're a Trumpist to see that he's saying the exact same thing that they've accused Democrats of saying for decades now. How do they come out of that?
And I don't know if they. I mean, I don't know if they do. I mean, I guess that's kind of like leading into the next aspect of what I want to talk about is the actual application of the actual equitable application of gun rights across the board. Because I think we can all, rest, with the consensus that guns aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Even if we outlaw them tomorrow, they would be in basically caches, in the wilderness, somebody's pickup truck somewhere, it's not just, it's kind of, baked into American society. But then when we talk about gun violence and how gun violence affects different populations, and with both of you all being attorneys, what's your perspective on, the mass adoption of gun culture and how it will affect different populations? Because we have seen historically increases. If you of color who are being shot, just for holding, a bag of Skittles, and then, I can imagine, I do imagine that being a natural deterrent to individuals who may be thinking, yeah, maybe I should go and get a gun, and then you're thinking, well, if I get pulled over by the cops or whatever, the chances of me walking out of that encounter go down significantly, because we've had people like Philando Castile, shot even after announcing I have a gun on me, in the car. So what's your take on that, gentlemen?
Mark, I'm going to let you go first.
That's fine. I don't think that we can leave out the minority experience from any consideration of future policies. And Philando Castile is an absolutely perfect example of that. That no matter what gun control policies lie in the future, we have to recognize the problems that we've had in the past of minorities being over policed and using these possession crimes and others to further oppress minorities in the justice system. We need more representation in the debate, and let's just we can't ignore that aspect of it.
Well, what I would add to that, though, is that any gun regulations, they're going to be enacted, it's going to be the minority community that the focus is on for enforcement. The fact is, you're not going to have police trying to raid the local white supremacist who's got hundreds of guns in his house. It's possible, but it's unlikely.
Yeah.
Now, I actually had a call from a guy today. He's actually a Navy veteran, African-American male, and he keeps a gun on him because he doesn't trust the police. And I don't blame him. Police violence is something that I've been harping on for years. We have it's not really a gun culture because the bulk of American citizens don't own weapons. Most of the weapons are hoarded by people who have a lot of them. But we definitely have a very pro-police culture. And what that's led to has been, civil rights abuses, not just with Philando Castile, but I mean, every state in the nation. I can find you something within the past week where an officer has violated someone's rights, no question.
Yeah.
Probably at Philadelphia.
Yeah. I mean, Philadelphia we talk about for a long time because, they've got Larry Krasner as their district attorney now. And one of the huge reforms he did when he took office was basically the list, what's called a Brady list. So officers that cannot be trusted to testify because they've lied before. He basically said, look, we're not going to accept any cases that these officers charge because they're scumbags. So you contrast that with yesterday. I am stunned that they got that guy out alive. And I'm grateful to Philadelphia PD that they did it, but I'm amazed that happened.
And I got into a debate, earlier about this very subject because, they were saying, well, obviously pro-gun, pro-Trump, pro-police. And, this individual was basically saying, well, if you didn't break the law, this wouldn't have been an issue. And, you see that, he was taken alive. So, the myth that, every single time a black person with a gun gets caught, he ends up dead, is gone. And I was basically arguing, what if, he basically was holding out for media attention to make sure, that whenever he was taken, if he was killed or shot, there would be, video evidence, there would be documentation. This assumption that every single cop, is a good cop is something that's pervasive among, hard right extremists, that, all cops are right, they should never ever be disobeyed, but at the same time, you're, stockpiling guns, to protect against the tyranny of the state, from what you're telling me. So two things don't add up. Either some people within the state can't be trusted, and that's why you're stockpiling guns, or, that's what you truly believe, and you're stockpiling guns for an entirely different purpose.
And yet there's no self-defense argument against police brutality or overreach. You gotta let it happen. You can't carry a gun against the police.
Yeah. And that's why I thought was the most absurd thing. It's like, that would be the exact case where you would, if you felt that you were being wrongly arrested, wrongly apprehended, wrongly accosted, that your rights had been violated or whatever, and you needed to stand your ground, that would be the case. But then you have, Attorney General Barr yesterday saying that, there should be a zero tolerance policy for, any kind of resistance to the police, which I think, is basically the bedrock of authoritarianism. You're just supposed to go if you're accused and the police come to get you, you're just supposed to go, and regardless of the situation.
You have to trust that the court will work in your favor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the folks that are the gun stockpilers, it's not about we're going to prevent the government from taking us. It's we're going to raise the potential cost high enough that they'll think twice. And the key example of that is the folks out west. And I can't remember the guy's name to save my life. I'm blanking.
Bundys.
Yeah,
yes, the Bundys. Mm-hmm. If you look at the facts of that situation, that guy he's a welfare queen. He's a white welfare queen because he's I'm serious. He's allowing his cattle to graze on public land.
True.
And get away with it. And someone finally says you can't do that. All of his buddies show up with a bunch of guns, and Bureau of Land Management backed off. Mm-hmm. They allowed him to continue being a welfare queen, but from the standpoint of, and I don't want to throw race into it, but the typical white folk gun owner that's stockpiling hundreds of weapons, that in their mind is their situation. They're going to be the next Bundy. Yeah. For a significant chunk of the country, that doesn't really fit into the rationale. It's not, I'm going to go ahead and stop the police when they show up for me, because the police, if they want to kill you, they're going to kill you. I mean, you got Daniel Shaver out west, you got Philando Castile. There's a long list of totally innocent people who've been arrested or murdered by police just in the past few years. It's more of I don't trust the police to get here in time. I don't trust them to do their job. I'm going to use it to defend my home if someone happens to break in or what have you. My last jury trial, one of the questions we asked is how many of you have had interaction with the criminal justice system? And you'd be astonished how many potential jurors have had zero interaction with police except for the fact that they've had a home break-in and they had to call 911. It's one of the most, even though crime-wise it's not a huge thing in the grand school, you know, you can go years without ever having someone break in. You know, out of 12 potential jurors, we had 9 people in that particular set who had a break-in. You know, they'd had to call 911 because of the fact someone had broken into their home. So most gun owners, that tends to be more of their profile. They're not doing it to stop a government overthrow or stop government tyranny or what have you. They're doing it to protect themselves or their families. So trying to find a political solution has to encompass trying to get the most vocal people, the gun nuts, to be some kind of something that they can't effectively block it, while at the same time convincing the folks in the middle that we're not going to make them criminals because of the fact that they don't think the state can be there to help them, while also having the folks who are anti-gun satisfy the objectives they're trying to reach, if that makes sense.
Mark?
Yeah, 100%. Although I think that we could serve the public a little better if we could push back on claims that guns are the best and first self-defense mechanism that that average citizens need, even in home break-ins, as you say. You can have a few people in a jury that have had a home break-in, and that may be their only police interaction. But if that leads them to get a gun, it's a little bit overkill. And the majority of break-ins or interactions with potential criminals where you've actually used a gun, the vast majority of those are that's the only gun in the situation. And so, and it's documented too that a baseball bat or mace is pretty much just as effective in 90% of those or something of those situations. So it's the need for such a lethal means of self-defense is far beyond what would justify the number of guns that are out there and for the purposes that they're cited as getting.
Gotcha. So as far as we talked a little bit earlier about the weapons that are I guess available to the private sector or the public sector, and then those that are available to the military, and Greg, you touched a little bit on this in regard to it. So there is starting to be some bleed where you're seeing military weapons that you would normally see deployed in the theater of war, deployed here domestically in the police force. Do you think that's exacerbating the problem? Because I mean, if I'm looking at the situation, I'm like, oh well, the cops, now they have this brand new Glock model or whatever that shoots. Yeah, or a tank or whatever. I need
or an MRAP or a helicopter or anything.
Yeah, I need to up my game if I'm going to protect myself against the state. I mean, that would be my perception if I were paranoid.
That might be true among the paranoid set, but I got to again emphasize that is a small number of total gun owners.
Okay.
It's kind of like we talk about on the side of capital, the richest 1% have like 50% of the wealth or something like that. The most paranoid gun owners stockpile a significant portion of the weapons. And then you have a long tail of a lot of gun owners who only have 1 or 2. And then you've got the rest of the population who doesn't have any. Does it add to the problem? Yes, because of the fact that it cements the notion that policing is supposed to be a force-based profession. Okay. We have decided that you have committed a crime. We're going to arrest you by any means necessary, and then we'll let the court sort it out. That's not how it's supposed to work. If you look at a lot of European countries, for example, a lot of their cops don't even have guns. They will have tasers. They will have pepper spray or OC spray in their case. They'll have batons. And the focus is on preservation of life first. And then they'll get the person eventually, and they go through the criminal justice system. And you have people here in America, they're like, oh, those people are such wusses. I can't believe they do that. But if you look at the actual outcomes in terms of crime reduction, loss of life, and everything else, statistically, Europe ends up better off because of that system. But if you have anyone even hint at the notion of disarming the police, or at the very least stop giving them weapons of war through the 287G program and these other programs they use to share military grade weaponry, folks lose their minds. And that's both sides of the political aisle. Republicans will call you a cuck, soy boy, sissy, but even liberals, will say.
I'll do more than hint at that. I'll say that, has to be a fact of mutual disarmament if there's going to be any disarmament at all.
Which I don't think I think that's a pipe dream. I don't think there's going to be mutual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, seriously.
And that's why I think any answer in regard to gun control has to involve guns. There is no, I'm not some, pie in the sky, pacifist that believes.
Sure.
I mean, we are creatures built on conflict. Tribalism is always going to exist. There's been wars throughout time. It's always been an arms war. Nobody's going to, turn in all their nukes, turn in all their tanks, turn in all their jets, turn in all their drones, and we're just going back to sticks and stones. No one's doing that anytime soon. And so I think realistically, it then comes down to measuring and evaluating, how we educate the population, about these weapons that exist, that people use, that people can even 3D print if they want to, educating people about them, and then also punishing in some way those individuals who violate their rights, and then trying to figure out some sort of deterrent to address the actual root causes, because that's what that's what infuriated me so much about the comparison between what happened in Philadelphia and then what happened in Dayton and what happened in El Paso. You're talking about different reasons, and I don't believe that the person in Philadelphia was mentally imbalanced. Basically you were talking about a career criminal, from what I've read, what I've been told. I'm not trying to convict anybody, but you're talking about a career criminal who had a history of run-ins with the police, who basically had firearms and did not trust that he was going, or basically was pushing back against going with the police. I don't know whether or not he didn't trust them. I'm not going to try to think about it. But then you also have, in the case of Dayton, in the case of El Paso, individuals who made very, very calculated decisions about stockpiling weaponry, stockpiling ammunition, casing locations, and then going out and indiscriminately shooting people. I feel like, it's two different animals, and I feel like, we need to talk about underlying causes and how to address those underlying causes. And I feel like the underlying causes for those different animals are distinctly different.
Well, I don't think you're going to find a common underlying cause if the focus is on looking at mass shootings.
Yeah.
Because the challenge is each time there's some difference that, the only one that might potentially have had a policy solution would have been in, I think it was Vegas, where the guy was using a bump stock. Mm-hmm. That at least is a policy outcome. Now, bump stocks have always existed. You can use the little loop on your jeans as a bump stock if you know how to use weapons. Mm-hmm. But at the very least, it would have made it harder for that particular shooter.
I think that we, just sorry to interrupt. I think that we also had one a little bit before that. It might have been the Orlando shooter who was who had been on some kind of, not necessarily a terrorist watch list, but he would have been prevented from getting a gun.
The Pulse nightclub shooting down in Florida, FBI had him on their list twice, and they didn't do anything about it.
And that was a policy that that either got stifled in Congress or couldn't move. So we have seen policy solutions that would have prevented something if enforcement was there. But go ahead.
Right. No, you're right. I mean, so there's different pieces to look at. So in terms of body count, it's not the mass shootings that should be the policy motivation. It should be the everyday stuff. Here in Durham, we've got a recent sharp rise in homicides, and we suspect that it's mostly related to gang violence. So you have to focus on gang interdiction here in Durham if you're going to get that body count to drop. But if you look at the El Paso, for example, it's my dog is spazzing out.
My dog's in here too.
If you look at the shooter in California, the shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand, the shooter in El Paso, mm-hmm. those types of guys are focused on white supremacist racial violence that, frankly, policy is not going to fix. That's a we need to replace the president type issue, because he's bringing forth this type of stuff that used to be, these people used to be kept on the fringe, and now they're all organizing and shooting up churches in South Carolina and everything else.
I think, to be fair, and I don't mean to defend anybody in that, but that kind of hate was present in the past before our president came in.
Yeah, I agree. The challenge is also, it's a combination of technology, so and 4chan, and in that case, you've still got the present misogyny and everything else, but there's also some evidence that there's mental illness involved. So our mental health care system needs work. And that is an ongoing thing with not just mass shooters, but with a lot of day-to-day violence as well. How we deal with mental health care here is terrible. I mean, there's no way to overstate how bad it is. So that is an aspect of it. You also need to have a way for local jurisdictions to deal with, people like Mark. Before we talk about red flag laws and that sort of thing, where if someone's making rumblings that they want to go shoot someone up, the court can intervene and say, okay, we're gonna take your guns for a little bit. We have something similar here in North Carolina with our domestic violence protective orders, that if, say a husband's beating his wife, as part of a no contact order against him, the court can take any weapons he might have. Yeah. These type of red flag laws would expand that to anyone potentially dangerous. And it still allows the flexibility for judges to try and deal with that problem. The challenge. Go ahead.
I think we're starting to, and this is, I guess this is that area of nuance that arises out of red flag laws, because just like you were talking about earlier in regard to online censorship and whatnot. If someone says something, oh, I hate the president, I could just kill him or whatever, immediately you have the FBI. No, I did not intend to kill the president. So if anybody listening to this, that's not what I said. But exactly, I just got flagged. But yeah, you have people who might convey something like that online in exasperation, or they may not even be serious about actual execution or whatever. And then, as people become more frustrated, I expect people to communicate feelings and sentiments like that in but so many ways, whether it be through imagery. I don't expect a lot of people to do it explicitly, because they're not trying to get a visit from the Alphabet Boys, but I do.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think you made somebody made the point on the last week's episode that we have one of the largest data collection plants in the world, collecting every message and post on in the world going on, and so at what point do we accept that? Look, maybe the pre-crime division is a adequate form of deterrent or violence enforcement. We have the Space Force this week, or this year. Next year we've got pre-crime, and all of a sudden crime goes down because you can't.
It sounds great. It sounds great and terrifying at the same time.
I mean, that may be the world that we're looking at in the future. Is that comfortable? Or is safety more comfortable? You have to recognize, at least in political science or whatever, that you're always going to have to give up a certain amount of privacy or comfort for safety, or rights. Rights for safety, really. There's a balance that's always going to be drawn. That if you're a Republican president, you let a lot of guns on the streets, or you lax policies, then all of a sudden you're around a lot more guns that who knows if it's going to go off accidentally or not. But
True.
We have we at least have the technological future to be wary of.
Well, the greater the gun, the greater the amount of guns, that's just logical. The more guns you have, the greater the risk of gun violence being a thing.
Right. I mean, there's never a shooting that takes place that doesn't happen in the presence of a gun. I think that's trivial.
Yeah, no one's throwing bullets at each
But
other.
I think that's trivial, but it's kind of the case that we don't have shootings where guns don't exist, right?
Yeah, I mean that's worth. I think that's worth noting. It's obvious, but I think it's worth noting because I'm tired of the guns don't kill people, people kill people. No, people kill people with guns. We can accept if we can accept that reality, then we can start moving forward. But if we just try to pretend like it's a non-issue, then I think that's not productive at all. So I think we can all acknowledge that guns
Yeah, guns don't grow legs and walk around killing people.
shooting people. No, they don't.
I think we know this to be the fact. But
Greg, you were talking earlier about. I do want to. I'm going to touch on what Greg was talking about with the Pulse nightclub shooting because I did. This was one thing I did not know that you just brought to my attention. I didn't know that the guy was on FBI watch list and had 2 times to grab him. I guess that's another that kind of dovetails into the red flag laws. At what point, and also what Mark was just talking about in regard to a Trump pre-crime division, and that sounds fucking terrible. Like but
and, if I can add on to that, there's a lot of defense of gun rights that I hear that is just we have a lot of gun control measures on the books. We have a lot of red flag laws and those things already, and it's up to ATF and it's up to a lot of enforcement agencies, including sheriffs, local sheriffs, and whatever, to enforce those and go and remove guns from dangerous people's houses. And a lot of times when it doesn't happen is when we have these things, dangerous personnel that are known by the authorities that are going out and committing these things. When we have a government that's not doing its job already.
True. So what in regard to doing their job, I guess that's what I was trying to get to in regard to what Greg was talking about. Like, at what point would you be able to ask, or would you be able to intervene in regard to addressing, a potential gun, a gun nut? I mean, I guess that's the big thing is if we're talking about these things being ubiquitous to the point where everybody's open carrying, then there's no way for us to turn. I'm like right now, if somebody walks into a Walmart with an AR-15, I can at least make a conscious decision to say, where are the exits? I'm getting the hell out of here. But if everybody in there is sporting an AR-15, the AR-15 nut job who actually, wants to come kill people, he's got instant cover. Everybody else who's already got one. Now, given, whenever he decides to start shooting, obviously there's a bunch of guns that are going to be available to shoot back at him if they so choose to. But still, he has tactical advantage because he knows what he's going to do whenever he goes into Walmart, where I am just going for a carton of milk. And so I'm not paying attention. So if he decides to go to the milk aisle and start off in the milk aisle, and he's got a death wish, he may be able to take out, 5, 10, 15, 20 people who aren't looking for anybody to start shooting. And before he gets taken down, if that's the case. And he may even, find situations or places where, that are more soft in regard to, who's carrying. Because I don't imagine everybody going to church. I imagine there being, an industry, that pops up in regard to security, where you have more individuals, who are policing, places of worship and whatnot. But if you can eliminate those 2 or 3 guards who are guarding the front door or whatever, then everybody else, is slim, easy pickings on the inside. So I mean I guess that's where we are right now. Is how do we distinguish threats in such a world where everybody has access?
That's part of the pickle. I mean, the short answer is it's tough to know. So in the Pulse nightclub shooters case, Omar Mateen, he was investigated by the FBI in both 2013 and 2014 because they thought he was a terrorist, and they didn't do anything. He was put on the terrorist watch list. He was later removed, but there had to have been some basis. Well, let me back up. The government is incompetent. Period. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to have a not incompetent government. Mark, I know from your military service, hurry up and wait. I'm sure you've had many moments where you would talk about the incompetence of government. So you've got
officers, yeah.
Right. So you challenges where you have to have a government in place. it has to treat everyone equally, to respect rights like due process and everything else. But at the same time, it's a system based on people. People are fallible. You will never have an infallible. So you would hope that if the FBI is investigating this particular individual, there had to have been some basis for them to do that, other than the fact that it was just his name. You know, contrast that with post 9/11, where anyone with an Arabic sounding name, we were going to go ahead and put on a watch list just as, you know, we're now 18 years later. For them to have been investigating him, theoretically, they had a reason. And in that type of scenario, that's something where a red flag law will potentially apply, as long as it is put in place prior to trying to take the person's weapons. So the law is known ahead of time, and it provides a method for, you know, dealing with due process. So there's a hearing before a judge, there's a chance to be heard, and so on. That helps.
So you're not advocating for a Trump pre-crime division. That's what it sounds like. Until
I would never trust the government to do anything pre-crime at all. You know, part of my job is criminal defense. I see police screw up every day. Mm-hmm. You know, I have clients who are legitimately guilty, and then my job is to try and minimize the ongoing damage to their life because of the fact they made a dumb decision. But I've also represented people who were actually mistaken for someone else, or the only reason they got arrested is because a cop was pissed off. They hadn't actually broken any law. Or, you know, I just had a case in Raleigh last week where Biscuit, stop. Hey, sorry, my cat is getting.
It's okay.
You know, I just had a case last week where we took to trial where a woman was arrested for playing Malcolm X in her backyard while she was gardening because of the fact that there's a very vague noise ordinance in Garner, and the white police officers didn't like the fact that she is a Black Power activist, you know. So I will never trust the government. A key example is on the issue of what is the biggest threat to society right now in terms of domestic terrorism. I think it's Nazis, frankly. I mean, we've already had several Nazis kill people. Yeah. But if you look at the FBI, they have identified Black identity extremists as the bigger threat. I've only met like one in my entire life, and I know a lot of African Americans in the state. You know, I'm sure they exist, but there's not as many as there are Nazis who I've actually seen come to Durham after that statue got taken down downtown. Yeah. So it's just something where we're relying on an inherently fallible system to detect threats, and the system is never going to be competent to do that, but you got to do something. So that's part of why, you know, I support red flag laws, because it relies on that granular local structure. Someone who knows this person has brought them to the attention of not they're a threat, which is also piecemeal. It's not going to be something that Congress is going to be able to legislate and make the gun problem go away. It's a ground up solution. So to go back to your question, the short answer is I don't know. I don't know how threat detection is going to work effectively, whether there are guns or not. Because, I mean, the main challenge with stochastic terrorism, this kind of random acts of mass, the person who wants to kill people, the tactical advantage of knowing what he's intending to do, and everything else is fundamentally reacting to that.
I mean, and I'll let Mark finish out with this, because we're at the 7:58 mark, but basically, it sounds like from what you're saying, Greg, is that a combination of kind of a hybrid solution where you have these local red flag laws that allow individuals to react at the ground level, combined with some, I don't necessarily believe in a pre-crime unit, because I believe that would go all kinds of bad ways, which means that we need to have some, you know, proper stewardship of any kind of oversight of any kind of predictive deterrent. But I do think a predictive deterrent would be helpful. You wouldn't necessarily arrest anybody, but I feel like, you know, right now, if I go and you know, I have a Google search of nuclear, you know, weapons, how to build a nuclear bomb, you know, you see I've gone and I purchased, you know, some yellow cake off the black market or whatever, you know, at certain levels, obviously I've broken laws and I'll be apprehended, because being in possession of those materials, you know, is illegal. But I feel, you know, that same oversight could be applied to, you know, just the Google searches of, you know, an average Joe in regard to gun ownership and protection. And then, you know, there are certain indicators, like I said, if you can determine, you know, if you can predict buyer behavior and target them with ads, I feel like you can predict that kind of violent antisocial behavior, and at least, increase monitoring. Do you think surveillance would be a bad thing? An increase in surveillance would be a bad thing, Mark?
So let's at least just put this in terms of a gun control measure that has broad acceptance in the public, which is background checks. Of course, not every mass shooter or person who uses a gun in a crime is getting one fresh off the shelves. I understand that it's not going to be perfect, whatever. But if we could just reduce the number of crimes that exist, right after somebody buys a gun, or soon, in the vicinity when, they've built up a certain online presence or criminal presence, that a background check would prevent. I think in those cases, a gun seller, which frankly, should also include private sales, should be required to undergo a background check. Um, that maybe includes a green, yellow, red light based on a collection of online analysis. I think of course that's arbitrary. Of course, it's subject to a lot of very deep and mysterious market forces and